50 Marines were standing outside a small house before sunrise, and nobody in the neighborhood could explain why. The words spread from porch to porch faster than the morning wind. Curtains shifted. Front doors cracked open. Cell phones appeared in trembling hands. On Maple Street, a quiet working-class neighborhood on the edge of Savannah, Georgia, people stepped outside in slippers and robes to stare at a scene that made no sense. A long line of Marine vehicles sat parked neatly along the curb. Men and women in uniform stood calmly beneath the pale glow of streetlights. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was moving. They simply waited. The sky above them was still dark blue, caught between night and dawn. A thin layer of mist drifted across freshly cut lawns. Mrs. Patterson from across the street clutched a coffee mug and whispered, "What on earth did that boy do?" Nobody answered, because everyone was looking at the same small house. It was not a mansion. It was not owned by a politician or celebrity. The paint was fading near the porch steps. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side. Wind chimes clicked softly against each other whenever a breeze passed through. It belonged to 17-year-old Jamal Carter and his mother. Jamal was not famous. He was not rich. Most people barely noticed him. He worked after school at a neighborhood grocery store stocking shelves and pushing carts. He kept his grades up. He helped his mother pay bills when he could. On most evenings, he walked home carrying a backpack that looked older than he was. Nothing about his life suggested that 50 Marines would ever gather outside his front door. Yet there they were, standing quietly beneath the fading stars. Across the street, more neighbors emerged from their homes. Questions floated through the cool morning air. Had something happened? Was someone important inside? Was this some kind of military operation? Nobody knew. Inside the Carter house, the lights remained off. The world had not yet awakened behind those curtains. The Marines showed no impatience. Some held small folders. Others carried nothing at all. One older officer occasionally checked his watch before returning his gaze to the front porch. His face was serious, but not angry. Respectful. Almost emotional. A local news van arrived at the end of the block after receiving several phone calls from curious residents. A cameraman stepped out and immediately stopped walking when he saw the unusual gathering. Even he seemed unsure what story he was looking at. The first rays of sunlight began creeping over the rooftops. Golden light touched the edges of uniforms and reflected softly from polished buttons. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. A lawn sprinkler clicked on. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary neighborhood. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Because less than 24 hours earlier, nobody on Maple Street had seen anything unusual. Nobody knew about the sandwich. Nobody knew about the old woman waiting near the bus stop. Nobody knew about the quiet act of kindness that had been repeated day after day without recognition. And nobody could have imagined that a decision made by one teenage boy would bring 50 Marines to his doorstep before the next sunrise. 24 hours earlier, Maple Street looked exactly the way it always did. The morning sun warmed the sidewalks. Children waited for school buses. Delivery trucks rolled through the neighborhood. Nobody paid special attention to Jamal Carter as he stepped out of his small house, wearing a faded gray hoodie and carrying his backpack over one shoulder. At 17, he had mastered the art of being unnoticed. He was the kind of teenager who held doors open for strangers and then kept walking before they could thank him. The kind who stayed late to help clean up after community events without putting his name on any volunteer lists. As he headed toward school, his mother called from the front porch. "Have a good day, baby." Jamal smiled and waved. "You too, Mom." The screen door closed behind her with a familiar creak. By 3:30 that afternoon, school was over and Jamal had already changed into his work uniform at Harper's Market. The grocery store sat 3 blocks from the bus station and smelled faintly of fresh bread, coffee, and floor cleaner. For the next 5 hours, Jamal stocked shelves, gathered shopping carts from the parking lot, and helped customers find everything from canned soup to pet food. It was not exciting work, but it paid enough to help with household expenses. Around 8:45, his manager handed him a small paper bag. "These sandwiches did not sell today," she said. "Take one home." Jamal thanked her and slipped the bag into his backpack. A few minutes later, he clocked out and stepped into the cool evening air. Streetlights had already flickered on. The sky glowed deep orange near the horizon. Cars passed steadily along the avenue leading toward the bus station. Jamal walked the same route he followed every night. Past the laundromat, past the pharmacy, past the old brick church with the white steeple. Then he saw her again. The elderly woman sat alone beneath the covered bus shelter wrapped in a worn beige coat despite the mild weather. A shopping cart stood beside her filled with blankets, newspapers, and a few personal belongings. Jamal had noticed her for weeks. Every evening, she occupied the same bench. Every morning, she seemed to be there again. Most people walked past without looking. Some glanced briefly before turning away. Tonight was no different. Commuters hurried by with phones pressed against their ears. A city bus arrived, then departed. The woman remained exactly where she was. Jamal slowed his pace. The paper bag inside his backpack suddenly felt heavier. He looked toward the sandwich his manager had given him. Then he looked back toward the woman. She stared silently at the pavement, as if expecting nothing from anyone. For several seconds he stood there debating with himself. His wallet contained less than $20 until payday. The sandwich could easily become tomorrow's lunch. Yet something about the loneliness in that bus shelter tugged at him. Finally, he changed direction and began walking toward the bench. The old woman noticed him approaching and looked up slowly. Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple decision would change both of their lives before the next sunset. The old woman watched him approach with the cautious expression of someone who had spent a long time learning not to expect good surprises. The bus shelter hummed softly beneath fluorescent lights that flickered every few seconds. Traffic rolled past on the avenue. Somewhere across the street, a convenience store radio played country music through an open doorway. Jamal stopped beside the bench and shifted the backpack from his shoulder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he pulled the paper bag from inside his backpack and held it out. "Ma'am, they gave me an extra sandwich at work." The woman looked at the bag but did not reach for it. Her silver hair escaped from beneath a faded knit cap. Deep lines crossed her face like roads drawn by time itself. "I do not have any money," she said quietly. Jamal offered a small smile. "I am not selling it." The woman continued staring at him. A city bus pulled up nearby, opened its doors, then pulled away again. Still she did not take the sandwich. Finally she asked, "Why are you giving it to me?" Jamal glanced down at the bag. It was a simple turkey sandwich. Nothing special. Just something that might help somebody through the evening. "Because you look hungry." The answer seemed to catch her off guard. For a second, she simply blinked at him. Then she slowly accepted the bag. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was softer than before. Jamal nodded. "You are welcome." He turned to leave, assuming the conversation was over. "Young man." He stopped and looked back. The woman carefully unfolded the top of the paper bag. "What is your name?" "Jamal." She repeated it quietly, as if trying to remember it. "Jamal." Then she nodded once. "Thank you, Jamal." He smiled again and continued walking home. The cool night breeze carried the scent of rain from somewhere beyond the city. By the time he reached Maple Street, he had already stopped thinking about the sandwich. Homework waited on the kitchen table. His mother needed help carrying groceries inside. Life moved forward the way it always did. The next afternoon, school ended and work began. The hours passed slowly. Shelves needed stocking. Deliveries arrived late. A customer spilled an entire bottle of orange juice in aisle 6. By the time Jamal finished his shift, his feet ached and his stomach growled. Yet as he stepped outside Harper's Market, he found himself thinking about the woman at the bus shelter. Without really planning to, he walked back inside and spent part of his tip money on a bowl of hot soup and a fresh sandwich. 20 minutes later, he was standing beneath the same shelter lights. The woman looked up in surprise when she saw him. "You came back," she said. Jamal shrugged awkwardly. "I was already heading this way." The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. It was the beginning of a smile. As she accepted the food, neither of them noticed a man sitting inside a parked car across the street watching the exchange. He glanced toward the elderly woman, then toward Jamal, before slowly driving away into the darkness. At the time, it seemed like an unimportant moment. Later, it would become one of the most important details in the entire story. The visits became part of Jamal's routine so naturally that after a few days he stopped thinking of them as something unusual. School ended. Work began. The evening shift passed. Then, before heading home, he carried a meal to the bus shelter. Sometimes it was soup. Sometimes it was a sandwich and fruit. Once it was a hot chicken pot pie that filled the cool air with the smell of rosemary and pepper when he opened the container. Each night, the elderly woman accepted the food with the same quiet gratitude. Each night, She seemed a little less guarded than before. By the end of the week, she no longer waited until he walked away before eating. One Thursday evening, rain tapped softly against the metal roof of the shelter while traffic hissed across wet pavement. Jamal arrived carrying 2 cups of hot coffee. The woman looked surprised. "You remembered I like coffee." Jamal handed her a cup. "You mentioned it 3 days ago." She stared at him for a moment before looking down at the steam rising from the lid. A faint smile crossed her face. Most people do not listen that closely. Jamal sat at the opposite end of the bench. "My mother says people tell you who they are if you listen long enough." The woman laughed quietly. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. The sound seemed strange and beautiful at the same time, like a memory returning after years away. Over the next several evenings, they began talking more. Not about anything dramatic, just ordinary things. Favorite foods, weather, places they had lived. Jamal learned that her name was Evelyn. He learned she liked old jazz records and black coffee. He learned she always fed stray animals when she had something to spare. Yet whenever he asked about family, she gently changed the subject. One evening, while city lights reflected in puddles around the shelter, Evelyn stared across the street and said something unexpected. "Do you know what courage looks like?" Jamal shrugged. "Not really." She pointed toward a tired woman carrying grocery bags while holding a child's hand. "That." A few minutes later, she pointed toward a sanitation worker loading trash bins into a truck. "That too." Jamal listened. Evelyn folded her hands together. "People think courage always wears a uniform. Most days it looks like ordinary people getting through difficult mornings." The words stayed with him long after he returned home. The following afternoon, a group of teenagers from school spotted him leaving Harper's Market with a paper bag. One of them laughed when they realized where he was going. "You are still feeding that homeless lady?" another asked. Jamal kept walking. "Yeah." The boy shook his head. "Man, you are wasting money." Laughter followed him down the sidewalk. Jamal never turned around. 20 minutes later, he reached the shelter. Evelyn immediately noticed something was bothering him. "Rough day?" she asked. Jamal hesitated before nodding. Evelyn looked out toward the passing traffic. "The world is full of people who think kindness is weakness." She glanced back at him. "Do not let them convince you." Jamal smiled faintly. Neither of them noticed a black sedan parked half a block away. Inside, a middle-aged man watched the shelter through the windshield. He studied Evelyn carefully, then glanced at a photograph resting on the passenger seat before reaching for his phone. Moments later, he made a call. And for the first time in years, someone on the other end of that line heard a name they never expected to hear again. The phone call lasted less than 3 minutes, but its consequences would travel farther than anyone involved could imagine. Inside the black sedan, the man listened carefully, answered a few questions, then ended the call and remained motionless behind the steering wheel. Rain clouds drifted slowly across the evening sky above Savannah. The windshield reflected passing headlights as he looked once more toward the bus shelter. Evelyn sat on the bench holding a cup of coffee while Jamal listened to another one of her stories. To anyone else, they looked like 2 ordinary people sharing an ordinary conversation. The man knew better. He started the engine and drove away. Across town, in a quiet office filled with framed military photographs, another man lowered a telephone and stared at the wall. Colonel David Walker had spent years building a career defined by discipline, leadership, and impossible missions. Yet at that moment, none of those things mattered. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at an old family photograph resting beside his desk lamp. The picture showed a younger version of himself standing beside his mother many years earlier. For several seconds, he could not look away. Then he quietly sat down. Outside his office window, the sun was setting behind rows of oak trees. Inside, memories he had spent years trying to manage suddenly returned all at once. Meanwhile, Jamal remained completely unaware of any of this. The following afternoon, he arrived at the bus shelter carrying a small bag of groceries. The weather had turned cooler. A breeze scattered dry leaves across the sidewalk. Evelyn smiled when she saw him approaching. "You are becoming predictable," she said. Jamal laughed. "I'm not sure that is a compliment." She accepted the groceries and carefully removed an apple. Predictable kindness is not a bad thing. They sat quietly for a while watching traffic move through the intersection. The city seemed slower that evening. Less hurried. Less noisy. Eventually, Evelyn spoke again. "Do you know what people regret most?" Jamal considered the question. Not reaching their goals. Evelyn shook her head. No. She turned the apple slowly in her hands. Most people regret the people they stopped calling, the people they stopped visiting, the people they assumed would always be there. Her voice carried a weight that made Jamal glance toward her. For the first time, she looked genuinely sad. Before he could ask why, she changed the subject and pointed toward a flock of birds crossing the sky. The moment passed, yet the words stayed with him. Later that night, after finishing homework, Jamal found himself thinking about her story. Something about it felt personal. Something about it sounded less like advice and more like a memory. The next morning at school, the thought still lingered. After classes ended, he headed to work as usual. Hours later, carrying another meal toward the shelter, he noticed something strange. A dark vehicle was parked nearby again. Not the exact same spot as before, but close enough to catch his attention. The driver remained inside, watching, waiting. Jamal frowned briefly but continued walking. Across the street, the vehicle's occupant lowered a pair of reading glasses and looked directly at Evelyn. Then he reached for his phone once more. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, preparations quietly began moving forward. Names were being verified. Records were being reviewed. Travel arrangements were being discussed. And at the center of everything was a teenage boy who still believed he was simply bringing dinner to a lonely woman sitting at a bus stop. The next evening arrived wrapped in cold autumn air and a sky filled with low gray clouds. Jamal finished his shift at Harper's Market just after 8:30 and stepped outside carrying a paper bag filled with vegetable soup, fresh bread, and a small slice of apple pie. The smell drifted through the paper as he walked toward the bus shelter. Streetlights cast long pools of golden light across the sidewalks. Traffic moved steadily through the intersection, headlights reflecting off storefront windows. When the shelter finally came into view, Jamal slowed his pace. The bench was empty. He stopped for a moment, confused. Evelyn was always there. Rain, sunshine, weekdays, weekends. She was always there. He approached the shelter and looked around. The shopping cart was gone. The worn blankets were gone. Even the small stack of newspapers she kept beside the bench had disappeared. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Not panic. Not yet. Just concern. He waited 15 minutes. Then 20. 2 city buses arrived and departed. Commuters came and went. Evelyn never appeared. Jamal finally sat down on the empty bench. The paper bag rested beside him. The soup was still warm. The pie remained untouched. For the first time since meeting her, he realized how much he had come to expect those conversations. The stories, the advice, the quiet laughter. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You looking for the older lady?" Jamal turned and saw a bus driver standing nearby during a short break. "Yeah," he answered quickly. "Have you seen her?" The driver nodded. "Earlier today, around lunchtime." Jamal stood immediately. "Was she okay?" The driver hesitated. "I think so. Some people were talking with her. She looked tired." Before Jamal could ask more questions, the driver checked his watch. "Sorry, kid. That is all I know." Minutes later, the bus pulled away, leaving Jamal standing alone beneath the shelter lights. Across town, inside a quiet hotel room, Colonel David Walker sat beside a table covered with documents and photographs. One picture showed Evelyn nearly 20 years earlier. Another had been taken only days ago from a distance near the shelter. He stared at both images. The differences were painful. The similarities were undeniable. A knock sounded at the door. The man from the black sedan entered carrying a folder. "We confirmed everything," he said softly. David lowered his eyes. For several seconds he could not speak. Then he nodded once. "Thank you." Back at the shelter, Jamal finally picked up the paper bag and started walking home. The night felt colder than usual. Leaves skittered across the pavement in the wind. When he reached Maple Street, his mother immediately noticed something was wrong. "Where is your friend?" she asked gently. Jamal looked down. "I do not know." Later, long after homework was finished and the house had grown quiet, he sat beside his bedroom window staring into the darkness outside. He kept thinking about Evelyn's words from a few days earlier. Most people regret the people they stopped visiting. The memory would not leave him. Then, just before midnight, a phone call was placed from a hospital across the city. A nurse reviewed an identification card that had been found among a patient's belongings. And for the first time, the mystery surrounding Evelyn Walker began moving toward an answer. By 7 o'clock the next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds of Jamal's bedroom, painting thin stripes of gold across the wall. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured the empty bus shelter and the untouched conversations that normally filled his evenings. Downstairs, his mother was already making coffee when he entered the kitchen. She studied his face for a moment and immediately understood. "You are still worried about her." Jamal nodded. "I just wish I knew if she was okay." His mother placed a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes caring about people means not having all the answers right away. The words were comforting, but they did not erase the concern. Across the city, inside Memorial General Hospital, a nurse adjusted a blanket around Evelyn Walker's shoulders. The previous evening, a concerned passerby had noticed her sitting alone near a park several blocks from the bus station and called for assistance when she appeared exhausted. Now she rested quietly in a private room overlooking the hospital courtyard. Morning light spilled across the floor beneath the window. A vase of fresh flowers sat on a nearby table. Evelyn slowly opened her eyes and looked around. For a moment, confusion crossed her face. Then memory returned. She noticed the nurse and offered a faint smile. "Good morning." "Good morning, Mrs. Walker," the nurse replied. The name seemed to surprise Evelyn. Before she could ask how they knew it, another figure appeared in the doorway. Colonel David Walker stood completely still. He had imagined this moment hundreds of times over the years. None of those versions prepared him for the reality. His mother looked older than he remembered. Smaller. More fragile. Yet her eyes were exactly the same. The same eyes that had watched him leave for boot camp decades earlier. Neither spoke for several seconds. The room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Evelyn whispered, "David." The single word carried years of distance inside it. David stepped forward slowly. His eyes glistened. "Hi, Mom." Back at school, Jamal tried to focus on algebra, history, and chemistry, but his thoughts drifted repeatedly toward the bus shelter. During lunch, he even considered taking a city bus downtown to look for Evelyn himself. By afternoon, he was counting the hours until work ended. He needed to know what happened. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, conversations continued. Some were joyful, others were difficult. Years of misunderstandings could not disappear in a single morning. Yet something important had begun. The distance between mother and son was finally shrinking. During one conversation, David asked a question that immediately caught Evelyn's attention. "Who is Jamal?" A warm expression appeared on her face. The answer came without hesitation. "A good young man." David listened as she described the teenager who had brought food, coffee, and kindness when nobody else knew her name. She spoke about him longer than she spoke about herself. When she finished, David looked down quietly. Then he asked for every detail she could remember. That evening, as Jamal walked toward the bus shelter carrying another meal, he had no idea that somewhere across the city, powerful people were already learning his name. The bus shelter stood empty again when Jamal arrived that evening. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while cold air drifted through the open sides of the structure. He set the paper bag down on the bench and stared at the place where Evelyn usually sat. For the first time since meeting her, he felt truly alone there. Cars rolled past. A city bus stopped, loaded passengers, and disappeared into the growing darkness. Still no sign of her. After several minutes, Jamal picked up the bag and sat down. He looked at the untouched meal and quietly laughed at himself. "I guess I should have expected that someday," he said. Yet the words did not make him feel any better. Across the city, Evelyn sat beside a hospital window wrapped in a warm blanket. The evening sky glowed orange beyond the glass. Colonel David Walker sat nearby listening as she spoke. Her voice was stronger than it had been that morning. She told stories about the bus shelter, about the weather, about the people who passed by without noticing her. Then she spoke about Jamal again. Every few minutes his name returned to the conversation. David noticed. "You care about him," he said gently. Evelyn smiled. "He reminded me that kindness still exists." David lowered his eyes. "Most people walked past." Evelyn nodded. "Most did." She looked toward the sunset. "He never did." Silence settled over the room. Then Evelyn reached into the pocket of her coat, which rested on a nearby chair. She removed a small object and handed it to her son. David studied it carefully. It was an old Marine Corps ring worn smooth by time. The emblem remained visible despite decades of use. "I almost gave this away once," Evelyn said softly. "But I kept it because it reminded me of family." David stared at the ring for several seconds. The weight of everything that had been lost seemed to gather inside that tiny piece of metal. Meanwhile, Jamal finally stood and started the walk home. The paper bag remained in his hands. Streetlights reflected off damp sidewalks left behind by a brief afternoon shower. As he passed the convenience store, an elderly cashier stepped outside to lock the door. "You are the young man who helps the lady at the bus stop, right?" the cashier asked. Jamal looked surprised. "You know her?" The man nodded. "Everybody around here knows her face." He hesitated. Not everybody stopped to help. Jamal shifted awkwardly. He never liked being praised for something that felt normal to him. The cashier smiled. "The world needs more people like you." Jamal thanked him and continued home. That night, while Maple Street settled into silence, important conversations were happening elsewhere. Calls were placed to former Marines across several states. Travel plans were discussed. Names were added to lists. Nobody spoke about publicity. Nobody spoke about recognition. They spoke about gratitude. In the hospital, Evelyn eventually drifted to sleep. Before leaving the room, David paused beside her bed. He looked at the photograph a nurse had printed earlier that afternoon. It showed a smiling 17-year-old standing outside a grocery store in a faded gray hoodie. David studied the image carefully. Then he placed the photograph in his jacket pocket. By sunrise, dozens of people would know exactly who Jamal Carter was, and none of them would ever forget what he had done. Before dawn arrived, activity had already begun in places Jamal could not imagine. Inside military offices, private homes, and veteran organizations scattered across several states, messages quietly moved from one phone to another. The details were simple. An elderly mother had been found safe. A young man had cared for her when nobody knew who she was. Gratitude was owed. Nothing more. Nothing less. Meanwhile, Maple Street remained asleep beneath a blanket of darkness. A porch light flickered at the Carter house. Wind rustled through oak trees lining the sidewalk. Inside his bedroom, Jamal slept peacefully for the first time in several nights. He had no idea that his name was being spoken by people he had never met. Across the city, Colonel David Walker stood beside a hospital window looking down at the lights below. Savannah stretched into the distance beneath a clear night sky. Behind him, Evelyn slept comfortably. The steady rhythm of medical equipment filled the room. David glanced toward her and remembered the countless nights she had stayed awake when he was a child. The school projects she helped with. The meals she somehow managed to prepare when money was tight. The encouragement she gave before every challenge. For years he had focused on duty, service, and responsibility. Somewhere along the way, distance had grown where connection should have remained. The realization hurt. Yet alongside the regret came something else. Hope. Because against all odds, she was here. Safe. Alive. And when she talked about the recent weeks, one name kept returning. Jamal. Early the next morning, Evelyn opened her eyes to find sunlight spilling across the hospital floor. David sat nearby reading a folder. She smiled faintly. "You look like you have not slept." He laughed quietly. "Maybe not much." Evelyn studied him for a moment. Then she asked the question she cared about most. "Did anyone find Jamal?" David lowered the folder. "We know exactly who he is." Relief immediately softened her face. She leaned back against the pillow. "Good." David hesitated. "Mom, what made him different?" Evelyn looked toward the window. The answer seemed obvious to her. Everybody saw a homeless woman. She paused. He saw a person. Silence settled gently across the room. A nurse entered carrying fresh flowers. Another visitor arrived shortly afterward. Then another. Word of Evelyn's recovery was spreading. Yet she seemed far less interested in her own situation than in the teenager who had shared sandwiches and conversations at a bus stop. Back on Maple Street, Jamal prepared for another ordinary day. He grabbed his backpack, said goodbye to his mother, and headed toward school. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as always. Children waited for buses. Neighbors watered lawns. Dogs barked behind fences. Nothing suggested that extraordinary events were already moving toward his front door. As he walked away from the house, a dark SUV slowed briefly at the corner. The driver glanced toward him, checked a photograph, then continued down the street. A second vehicle passed 20 minutes later. Then a third. By noon, travel plans had been finalized. By evening, dozens of people would be on the road. And before the next sunrise touched the rooftops of Maple Street, the quiet kindness of one teenage boy would receive an answer far greater than he ever expected. Long before the sun appeared, engines quietly rolled into Savannah from different directions. Pickup trucks, sedans, SUVs. Nothing flashy, nothing designed to attract attention. Yet inside many of those vehicles sat men and women connected by a shared history of service, sacrifice, and loyalty. Some had retired years earlier. Others still worked as instructors, community leaders, or veterans advocates. They came from different states, different backgrounds, and different chapters of life. Yet they were all traveling toward the same destination. Throughout the night, messages continued arriving on phones. Addresses were confirmed. Arrival times were coordinated. No one spoke about publicity. No one wanted recognition. They were coming because an elderly mother had finally been found safe, and because she would not stop talking about a teenager who had treated her with dignity when the rest of the world barely noticed her. Meanwhile, Jamal's day remained completely ordinary. He attended classes, finished a history quiz, ate lunch with friends, and headed to Harper's Market after school. The routine felt familiar. Customers asked where to find items. Shelves needed restocking. Shopping carts collected near the entrance. Around 6 o'clock, his manager approached holding a clipboard. "You have been working hard lately," she said. "Keep it up." Jamal smiled politely and returned to work. If someone had told him that dozens of people were already driving toward Maple Street, he would have laughed and assumed it was a joke. Across the city, Evelyn sat comfortably in her hospital room, watching afternoon sunlight spread across the courtyard below. Fresh flowers now covered nearly every available surface. Nurses stopped by just to check on her. Visitors arrived carrying cards and well wishes. Yet Evelyn remained focused on one thing. "Has anyone spoken to Jamal?" she asked again. Colonel David Walker smiled. It was the 4th time she had asked that day. "Not yet." Evelyn looked out the window. "When you do, tell him he never needed to bring all that food." David laughed softly. "I do not think he was looking for permission." The comment made her smile. Then she became thoughtful again. "The world spends too much time noticing important people," she said quietly. "Sometimes the best people are the ones nobody notices at all." David nodded. Those words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Late that evening, as Jamal walked home beneath streetlights glowing against the dark sky, he noticed several unfamiliar vehicles parked near the far end of Maple Street. He barely gave them a second thought. Maybe relatives were visiting someone nearby. Maybe neighbors were hosting guests. The possibilities seemed endless. He stepped inside his house, helped his mother clean the kitchen, finished his homework, and eventually headed upstairs. Outside, more vehicles arrived. Porch lights reflected across polished windshields. Quiet conversations took place in driveways and parked cars. People checked addresses one final time. Some looked toward the Carter house and smiled. Others simply sat in silence. By midnight, everything was ready. And as Jamal drifted to sleep unaware of what awaited him, 50 people prepared to show one young man that kindness never disappears. Sometimes it simply takes a little time to find its way back home. At 5:43 the next morning, the first sound on Maple Street was not an alarm clock or a garbage truck. It was the quiet rumble of engines settling into place. Dawn had not yet broken across the horizon. Most porch lights were still glowing against the darkness. Inside the Carter house, everything remained silent. Jamal slept upstairs. His mother slept down the hall. Neither had any idea what was happening outside. One by one, vehicles lined the street. Men and women stepped out wearing Marine Corps jackets, veteran organization caps, and neatly pressed civilian clothing. Some carried folders. Others carried small gifts. A few held framed photographs. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody blocked traffic. They simply gathered with calm purpose. Curtains began shifting throughout the neighborhood. Front doors cracked open. Curious neighbors stepped onto porches wrapped in robes and sweaters. Mrs. Patterson across the street nearly dropped her coffee mug when she counted how many people were standing near the Carter house. The number seemed impossible. More vehicles continued arriving. The eastern sky slowly brightened from black to deep blue. Conversations remained low and respectful. Several Marines exchanged stories about Evelyn. Others discussed the long journey that had finally brought mother and son back together. At the center of every conversation was the same teenager. The teenager none of them had met. The teenager who never asked for attention. A little after 6 o'clock, Colonel David Walker arrived. He stepped from a dark SUV and looked toward the modest house. The paint on the porch railing was slightly worn. A basketball rested beside the front steps. Wind chimes moved gently in the morning breeze. David smiled softly. For weeks he had heard about this place through his mother's stories. Now he was finally standing in front of it. Nearby, several Marines greeted him respectfully. He thanked each one for coming. She wanted him to know he mattered, David said quietly. That is why we are here. Heads nodded throughout the crowd. Across the neighborhood, more residents gathered outside. Some expected bad news. Others worried something terrible had happened. Yet the mood outside the Carter house felt strangely peaceful. There was no tension, no anger, only anticipation. Upstairs, sunlight finally began slipping through Jamal's bedroom curtains. He shifted beneath the blankets and slowly opened his eyes. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then he heard something unusual. Car doors. Voices. More voices than should have been outside that early in the morning. Confused, he sat up and rubbed his eyes. Downstairs, his mother had already heard the sounds as well. She stood near the front window, staring through the curtains with a shocked expression. Jamal walked into the hallway. Mom. She turned toward him. For several seconds, she seemed unable to speak. Finally, she pointed toward the front door. Baby, she whispered. I think you need to see this. Jamal frowned and headed downstairs. Outside, the growing crowd quietly turned toward the house. Colonel Walker stepped forward. The first rays of sunlight touched the street behind him. The entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Then the front door handle slowly began to turn. The front door opened slowly. Cool morning air drifted into the house as Jamal stepped onto the porch wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans, still trying to understand why dozens of unfamiliar people were standing outside. The sight stopped him completely. The street was full. Men and women stood quietly beneath the early morning sunlight. Some wore Marine Corps jackets. Others wore veteran organization insignia. Several held small American flags. A few carried framed photographs. No one spoke at first. The silence felt almost sacred. Jamal glanced toward his mother standing behind him in the doorway. She looked just as confused as he was. Across the lawn, Colonel David Walker took a step forward. His expression was calm, respectful, and sincere. Jamal Carter? He asked. Jamal nodded cautiously. Yes, sir. David smiled. My name is David Walker. For a moment, the name meant nothing. Then something clicked. The bus shelter. Evelyn. Jamal's eyes widened slightly. David noticed immediately. You knew my mother as Evelyn. The entire street seemed to disappear from Jamal's awareness. He stared at the man for several seconds. She is okay? He asked. It was the first question that came to mind. Not who these people were. Not why they had come. Just whether she was safe. A faint smile appeared on David's face. Yes, she is safe. Relief washed across Jamal's expression. Several people in the crowd exchanged glances. The answer seemed to confirm everything Evelyn had told them about him. David reached into his jacket and removed a photograph. It showed Evelyn sitting beside a hospital window wrapped in a blanket, smiling for the camera. He handed it to Jamal. She asked about you every day. Jamal carefully accepted the picture. For a moment, he simply looked at it. Then he smiled. Across the street, neighbors watched in complete silence. None of this resembled what they had imagined. There were no accusations. No conflict. Only gratitude. David cleared his throat. My mother told us what you did. Jamal looked confused. I just brought her food. Several people smiled when they heard the response. David slowly shook his head. No. He looked toward the crowd behind him. You treated her like she mattered when nobody knew who she was. The words settled over Maple Street. One by one, people stepped forward. A retired Marine thanked Jamal. A military spouse thanked him. A veteran who had traveled from another state thanked him. Each carried a different story, yet they all shared the same message. What seemed small to Jamal had meant everything to someone else. His mother stood on the porch listening with tears in her eyes. She had always taught her son to help people whenever he could. Seeing the result of those lessons standing in front of their house felt almost unreal. Then David opened a folder and removed a handwritten note. This is from my mother, he said. Jamal accepted the letter carefully. Before reading it, he looked back toward the crowd. Nearly 50 people had traveled through the night because an elderly woman had told them about a teenager who refused to walk past someone in need. The morning sun climbed higher above the rooftops. Light reflected from windows and car hoods. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes stirred softly in the breeze. And standing on that small porch, Jamal was finally beginning to understand that kindness had a way of traveling much farther than anyone could see. Jamal waited until the crowd grew quiet before opening the letter. The paper was folded neatly, and he immediately recognized the careful handwriting. For a moment, everything around him seemed to fade. The neighbors, the vehicles, the gathering on Maple Street. All he saw were the words written by the woman he had worried about for days. Dear Jamal, thank you for seeing me when it would have been easier to walk away. Thank you for every meal, every conversation, and every moment you treated me like a human being instead of a problem. You reminded me that kindness still exists. You reminded me that people still care. Most of all, you reminded me of the values I spent my life trying to teach my son. By the time he reached the bottom of the page, Jamal's vision had blurred. He lowered the letter slowly and looked toward Colonel Walker. The older man nodded as though he already knew exactly what the letter said. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, members of the crowd stepped forward and placed small items on a table that had been brought to the front yard. Photographs, coins, handwritten notes, challenge coins from military careers spanning decades. None of them were expensive gifts. They were personal treasures, symbols of respect, stories carried in metal, paper, and memory. A retired Marine explained that he had carried one coin through 3 deployments. Another veteran placed a framed photograph on the table and said Evelyn had once volunteered at an event that helped his family during a difficult year. A military spouse handed Jamal a card signed by dozens of people whose lives had been touched by Evelyn's kindness. The morning slowly transformed into something nobody on Maple Street would ever forget. Neighbors who had never spoken to one another began sharing coffee and stories. Children played on front lawns while veterans laughed together beneath the growing warmth of the sun. Jamal's mother stood beside him, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes. She looked at her son and saw the same young man she had raised. The only difference was that now the world seemed to see him too. A little before noon, Colonel Walker approached him one final time. My mother would like to see you when she leaves the hospital. Jamal smiled. I would like that. David extended his hand. Jamal shook it firmly. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, but it carried the gratitude of a family that had finally found its way back together. As the gathering slowly came to an end, vehicles began leaving Maple Street. The crowd grew smaller. The conversations faded. Yet something remained behind. Not the gifts. Not the attention. Something quieter. Something deeper. Standing on the porch, Jamal watched the last vehicle disappear around the corner. The neighborhood gradually returned to normal. Wind chimes stirred gently in the afternoon breeze. Sunlight shimmered across the windows of nearby houses. Beside him, his mother slipped her arm around his shoulder. Neither spoke for a while. There was no need. Somewhere across the city, Evelyn sat beside a hospital window, looking toward the same bright sky. She was not famous. Jamal was not powerful. Neither had changed the entire world. But one lonely woman had been seen. One young man had chosen kindness. One family had been reunited. And in the end, that was enough. Sometimes the greatest stories do not begin with heroes, wealth, or influence. Sometimes they begin with a sandwich, a bus stop, and a person who simply refuses to walk past another human being in need.